The topics that we'll cover today are: what does the deploy phase schedule look like? What are some of the key elements that happen during the deploy phase that you should be prepared for, and activities that you should understand a little bit more about? Then we'll talk about testing and what are the various kinds of testing, when you should do testing, how early do you start, and then the importance of making sure everything is really tested well. And then we'll talk about the approach for training. So how much information do you want to give people? How do you want to give that information to people? There's a lot to be thought about there. And then we'll get into the practical activities that happen during Go Live weekend and cutover weekend, just to make sure that we're ready to hit that and hit that successfully. All right, so on our Stoneridge proven process, we've now gone through the align, define, create, and now we're in that deploy phase. So this is step 4 of the process, the last step before we go live, and then next time we'll talk a little bit about one part of the deploy phase, which is that hypercare, and what do you do to make sure your team is well supported post go live. So last time I showed this schedule of what happens during the create phase. So for the various process groups that are going, that you have part of scope of this project, what activities are you doing during various sprints, and how JPods then lead into CRP sessions or conference room pilot sessions. So if you think about, like, when does the deploy phase start, the best way to think about it is at the end of that create phase, and it's typically when you're code complete. Now, I've had a few clients over history take code complete a little bit too literally, but it's generally the time when everything, or most everything, is done in terms of code. There can be times, if you've found something in the EDI, CRP, and Sprint 9, you might not have that coded by the time you want to start the deploy phase, but it's not worth holding up the whole deploy phase for one fix to get in there. So you have to have, you can't be too rigid with your policy of code complete. It should be majority code complete, or 95% code complete kind of thing. And that is the trigger to jump into the deploy phase. So in the deploy phase, then you'll see how you have UAT sessions that are aligned to those process groups that you do during the project as well. But let's jump into what does a deploy phase look like. So in this example, I have a 6-week deploy phase. So each of the, your deploy phase could vary. It could be anywhere from as little as 2 weeks for a very small implementation, but that's pretty rare. Generally 4 weeks to as much as like 12 weeks, depending on all the amount of effort that you want to have happen, the amount of testing that you want to do. If you're doing, less, if you're trying to do it in a week, I wouldn't necessarily recommend that. Unless it's phase 7 of a project you're already doing and it's more like of a sprint release. And if you're doing more than like 12 weeks, then you probably have too many things that should be in another phase of the project. So excuse me. So in a 6-week deploy phase, here are some things that you should be thinking about that happen in each of those weeks during the deploy phase. So in week 1, in your data migrations, I didn't talk about that as much here during the webinar, but I've got a chapter on that in the book that I recommend you take a look at. So you're doing several iterations of data migrations throughout the project, and you should be really close as you get to the deploy phase. So all of the code that's now in place should have, the imports should be coming into that custom code. So you do a test run of the data migration, and that's the test run that you use for UAT testing as well too. So you generally want that to be very close to correct. You'll do one more data migration test before you get into the final cutover process there in week 5. In environments, you got to make sure that all your environments are ready for testing. So there's typically a user acceptance testing environment that needs to be very ready. You also want to have your production environment ready by the time you get into the deploy phase. So those are things that should be happening at the end of the create phase. And then there's a lot of environment movement during the deployment phase. So you're moving test environments. So if you think about it, if there's a bug that you find in UAT, you've got to fix it. So code something in dev, move it to test, and then move it back to UAT. So there's a lot of moving of code that's happening here during the deploy phase. You generally want that to happen on a weekly basis, but sometimes it happens more frequently than that. And then testing, there's a lot of testing that's happening. You start with your process-centric testing the first couple weeks, and then in week 3 and 4, you get more to end-to-end, where things might cross multiple different process areas. In that case, you want to make sure that those are getting all tested out here before you're ready to go live. And then for training purposes, you typically start with user acceptance training. So just explaining them what user acceptance testing is, how they should be looking at any issues that they see. You have to do kind of some overview explanation of the system and the processes during that time. But then it's more focused on end user training. And I should have in there too, train the trainer, because as consultants, we would typically want to train your team members your project team members who will then conduct the training for the end user as well. And then there's bug fixing going on through all the weeks of the deployment phase. I mean, that's what your developers are doing. That's what your functional consultants are testing, retesting, and making sure that work. And then communication is important too. You are getting ready to go live. So setting communication for, now we're in the deploy phase. We've got a set schedule for go live. Here are the people that need to be in these various trainings. You've got your go, no-go meeting, and then your end go live communication as well. You also want to make sure your help desk team is really ready for this implementation as well too. And then a cutover plan, which I'll talk a little bit about, but what are the activities that are going on during go live, during that cutover process, making sure you've got that finalized, being ready then in week 5 to do a mock cutover where you push everything to production just like you're going to go live, and then week 6 is when you do that for real. So these are all sorts of different things that are happening during the deploy phase. So it is a very busy time for those resources that have been working on the project. This is crunch time, right? This is like preparing for the final exam. They need to be available and ready to be able to support the efforts going on during this phase. So now let's talk about how do you keep track of how you're doing during the deploy phase. So one of the key things that project managers should be doing is managing a go live dashboard. And as a general rule, you want to have green as in complete or on track, yellow as at risk, and then red is off track. So a couple different categories that you can use is, how is your cutover plan doing? Is that ready and tested? That's something you want to have done early on in the deploy phase. And then you want to be tracking your bugs and generally classify them in 3 groups. P1, typically companies will have 4 classifications of bugs, P1, 2, 3, and 4. We don't really think too much about P4s because they're generally a non-essential, kind of suggested when we have time we could fix this kind of thing. So as it relates to go live, you don't even really think about P4s. P3s are, again, nicer to have changes that would be useful, but they aren't required. They're not stopping anything. P2 bugs are generally something where there is a workaround for it, and you can do something different, but it's painful. And then P1 bugs are you can't perform a core function within your system, or there's a data damaging thing where when you create an invoice, it puts the wrong tax amount on your invoice out to customers. Those would be P1 bugs. You do not want to go live with any P1 bugs. And then generally, as you're setting your go live criteria, you talk about a limited number of P2 bugs, and you try to decide what is that number. Is it 5 to 10, something along those lines. So and then P3 bugs, the main thing that you want to do is make sure that you have them prioritized and scheduled for future releases. As many as you can knock out during this process, you want to try to do that, but the main focus is really on P1 and 2. And then data migration, making sure that your data migration iterations are on track so that you can get to that final successful one ahead of your go live weekend or your cutover weekend. The next thing you want to be thinking about is, do you have the security in place? Have you tested a lot of times when you're going through the create phase, the people that are in the system have system admin access, so they can do whatever they want. When you get into the user acceptance, and well, generally it should happen in CRP, but also in UAT, you start putting into place real security roles. So making sure those security roles are in place and ready to be used is key. Help desk readiness. So who is going to take those support requests after you go live? Generally, you want your help desk doing that. So they need to be ready ahead of time. Core team training, or the core training that you want to do, you want to get a status update on that. And then again, your communications, you want to try to have those done in advance as well too. So these are some of the main categories you want to be tracking throughout the deploy phase, and then indicate if they are at risk or off track so that you know. And in this case, you get 27 outstanding P2 bugs. That's a real big number. So you want to put additional focus on how do you get that number down to something a little bit more manageable. So entrance criteria. So when you think about how do you know if you're ready to get into user acceptance testing, you want to make sure that before you get into user acceptance testing, that you've got all your business scenarios have been fully defined. You want to make sure no open decisions exist for the processes. And the reason why you want these first two things is when you get to user acceptance testing, it's no longer time to like hear people's great ideas for how you can do something better. It's now time to just test what you got and go live with what you have. And that can be frustrating to people, especially if they haven't been exposed to it throughout the project, and now they start to get into the system and now they're like, oh wait, this could be better. Well, at this point, you've got a schedule you need to meet. So it's this time where you want to say, I'm sorry, we're not going to be able to accommodate that new process change you suggested. We're going to have to look at phasing that in over time. So it's really important to set those expectations as you go into user acceptance testing. You want to make sure that roles are defined. You want to make sure that that security is in place. You want to make sure your customizations exist, so they're in the software. Again, there might be some things that came out of CRP that weren't coded in time to do a CRP on, so those have to be in place for you to go into user acceptance testing. And you want to make sure that you've got a checklist for kind of checking off the key functionality and making sure that that's working. So the scope that's for each user acceptance testing is that the business processes that are identified for go live are in scope. So again, if it is something new that you added or something that's different, now is not the time to discuss those things. All your integrations, any ISVs you're using should be in scope. You want to use the security role that you're actually going to use in production. And then anything that comes up outside of that, you put it in DevOps and say this is a future release suggestion at this point. Because again, to keep to that schedule of 6 weeks or whatever your UAT schedule is, you got to keep marching through that. You got to keep your eye on getting this solution out the door at the time. And then here are the things you should be thinking about is like, what do we want to make sure that we achieve during user acceptance testing? And when can we sign off that user acceptance testing is complete? So one of the sign-offs is all priority 1 issues have been resolved. So as I mentioned, you do not want to go live with a priority 1 issue. You want to make sure that those have been buttoned up and solved. I mean, that can get to be one of the very difficult conversations that you have when you get to your go, no-go meeting is where are you at with priority 1 issues and will they be resolved in time to go live? If they are not resolved in time to go live, then you've got a tough decision on your hand of whether you can live with them or not. As a general rule, you want to do everything you can to make sure that those have been resolved in time. Priority 2 issues, like I mentioned, those are issues where there's a workaround, but it's probably painful. So you want to make sure that you have a plan and agreed timeline for resolution. And again, if you've got 27-ish priority 2 issues, that's probably too many. Your end users are probably not going to enjoy using that software if they've got workarounds like every third thing that they do in there. So you want to make sure that you've got that a plan for the small number of priority 2 issues that you have in place. You want to make sure that all of your processes have been signed off so that your business process owner or their delegate can go all the way through the process category from end to end with everything working. Again, there could be a P3 bug in there that's for this purpose considered working. If there's a P2 issue in there, that if you need to have a workaround for that, that's been identified and is known to the users, and you can train people on how to work around that. And then finally, you want to make sure that as you go through that process for the P3 issues that you have, you've got a priority ranking on them, and you can start to plan for them to get executed on in a later, in a later release. So these are the things that you want to make sure that as you set expectations for what's going to happen in user acceptance testing, that you've got this exit criteria that's been agreed to by everybody involved. Because you will have people who go through this and they'll find a P3 bug and they'll be like, well, we're not going live unless this thing gets fixed. It's like, well, just think bigger picture then. If we've got 100 users going live on the system, you've got one person with a minor problem, is it fair to the other 99 people not to go live with that issue that's sitting out there? So as a project owner, you've got to be thinking through these things and trying to understand what is the best interest for the business. The best interest for the business is generally not to go live if there's a P1 issue that's affecting a third of the users, causing bad data or sending out invoices that are wrong to customers like that. That is not worth going live for. You're better off pushing back to another date. But it's a difficult decision, and we'll talk about that more as we get ready to go live here. All right, let's switch gears and talk about training. So people really love systems that they know. Just think about software that you use today, and when someone brings up a competitive software, like even if you have an iPhone and someone says, oh, here's an Android Google Pixel, check out this phone, I bet you'll like it. Well, the general reaction is going to be, you know what, I'm happy, I know my iOS, I'm comfortable with it, I like this better. Now, it could be that they like Android phones better if they had given it a shot, but they haven't tried it because they like what they know. So that's how anyone who is about to use software is taking that perspective. The more comfortable they are with it, the more they're going to like it. So our goal as we train people to get ready to go live is to make sure they really, really know that system, because if they really know the system, they're going to like that system. So here's a little view of some of the training that should happen during an implementation. And so just clarify, like asynchronous, there's 3 different kind of media ways that you can provide training. Asynchronous to me is like a recorded online training, so you're watching a video. Synchronous would be more of an online instructor-led training, and then in person would be a, in person, somebody in the classroom with your hands on the keyboard. So in the headings there kind of talk about when you should do certain kinds of training. So a navigation overview, that's something that you can record fairly early on, and you can have people watch that. And so I encourage you to have a video like that that's available for your users so they can watch it and they kind of get a sense of how the solution works, like what are the key things you need to do to get into it, how what are the features around the grids and the menus within the software, so that you have a little idea of how to navigate around. So that's something you can do asynchronously. Of course, you can do it synchronously or in person as well too, but that's one of the easy things, I think, to record a video and encourage people to watch it. Now, when you're getting ready to start using the software, that's a good time to then get people in the software and do like a synchronous navigation overview where people are getting in and they're able to ask questions if they get stuck on something. But navigation overview is kind of the easy part. Now, when you start to get into the core job functions, that's when it can be a little bit more challenging. So I don't think it's a good idea to do like a video, hey, here's how you enter a sales order to the system, watch this video. Again, if you do something like that, it's not bad, but that's not really helpful. That's not the best way for people to learn. So the best way for people to learn would be in an in-person or synchronous style training where they get to learn the function, they get to walk through it, they get to ask questions. And you notice I have an in-person training for the sales order function during, and then I have a synchronous one after. And so it's really good to actually have two sessions, like one pre-go live and one shortly after go live, where you're helping reinforce it. Because when people learn before going live, which you have to do training before go live, they may not take the example as seriously as they're going to take it after they've got a customer on the phone or they're trying to process a transaction. They're going to take it a little bit more seriously. So doing a refresher training after go live, I highly recommend. And then another thing I recommend is if you have an advanced function, so let's say you're doing a return and you only do returns, 1 out of every 100 transactions that you take. If you spend a lot of time training them on how to do returns in the first training that they get, they might not digest the way to their core function. So if in that case, I actually recommend setting up a second session for how to do returns and just focus on that particular thing. But that's one of those things that you really need to do again. Then once they've gone live, if they get pretty comfortable with doing sales orders, like, okay, I've done 20 of these now, I kind of have the process down, it's still going to be hard for them to do a return the first time they have to do it for real. So making sure that you have a second session available or you've got people available who can help them through that process after go live is really important. Again, just try not to jam everything into one session because it's a lot for people to understand. Repetition is actually better than trying to teach them a very broad set of things. And then you get into items like periodic activities, like trying to do month end. Well, you can try to show them how to do month end before they go live, but as a general rule, people really aren't going to digest that because they're just not really thinking about it as much. So you do want to walk through some of the month end procedures and making sure they're all working in the system, but I would focus on training them on that post go live. And again, you're going to need some hand holding with complex things like month end as well too. So when should you do something in person versus when do you do something online? Obviously, that depends a lot on your office policy now. In the pre-COVID days, generally there were a lot of things done in person, but those days have changed now. Some of the value of being in person is just that they can ask questions of the instructor in real time, and the instructor can easily look over their shoulder. They can also get a sense of, the computers can be set up with the right screens. Everything can be in the right place. If someone is doing that on their own, they might not be quite set up as well. It can be challenging to get them in the right place. For less technical people, they feel a lot more comfortable if they've got somebody who could put their hands on the keyboard if they did have a particular issue. People also appreciate that attention of having someone there. So those are some of the reasons why you might want to do your training in person. Now, some of the values of actually being able to do something online is just, ease of scheduling. You don't have to, you can do multiple sessions. It's not quite as big of a lift to be able to actually do the session. You can save considerable money on travel. I've been involved in lots of implementations where they're flying people in, internationally to do some of these trainings, and that can be very expensive. It is fairly easy to raise your hand over Teams meetings, but you also maybe want to have multiple instructors, so someone who can jump in and do like a Zoom room or a Teams room for an individual person that might be having a challenge. And they can work well if you have the instructions ahead of time, but a lot of times there is something that the users need to do to make sure that they're set up to use it. Now with cloud-based software, it's generally pretty easy. The same login that they use to log into Microsoft 365 type services, whether it be OneDrive or Planner or something like that, it's going to be the same user that they log into Business Central or CRM or F&O. And then the other thing to think about if you're doing synchronous, one of the disadvantages could be that that people don't really have to show their work, so they could be sitting in the class, they could be shopping for something on Amazon or whatever instead of actually doing the work, which in person you can hover over their screen and go, nope, get off Amazon, get back into the application. So that's one of the things that you need to worry about, but there are ways to get around that, like having a checkpoint every 15 minutes. All right, everyone's going to show their screen and show the progress that they've made. So again, there are some ways to kind of get some of the in-person experience in a synchronous format as well too. I will say it is difficult to mix in-person and online. So if you've got like 8 people in the room and 2 people online, it can be hard to pay enough attention to the 2 people that are online. So just make sure that you are paying enough attention to them, and maybe there's another instructor or somebody on the line who can help those people that are online, because it's difficult to not pay attention to the people that are sitting in front of you because someone online is having a challenge. So just think that through as well too. But again, when it comes to training, my big keys are, get them in there as often as you can. Give them short tidbits where they've got their hands on the machine doing the process, and then make sure you're doing refresher training afterwards. And then make sure you have that resource, that power user who really knows the solution available to them, so they can ask questions and they don't feel stupid if they don't get something right away. All right, let's talk about what do you need to have in place to go live. So we talked about exit criteria for UAT, but let's talk about the overall go live criteria for the whole project. So one of the things you want to have is you want to have a cutover plan. So a cutover plan, again, is all the activities that you're going to do on the weekend of go live. What are the steps that need to be taken? And then as part of that cutover plan, I highly recommend outlining the amount of time it's going to take to do each of these activities. So how long is data migration going to take? And a lot of that has to do with, like, when can we shut down the old system? If you're open normally on Saturdays, you might have to not be open that particular Saturday based on the timing of that. So there should be a pretty good idea of how long everything should take. Something that's going to take a significant amount of time should be running overnight. And then at some point you should have a rollback plan. So I typically say if it's over a weekend and it's Sunday at 5 o'clock and you're not close to going live, you need to be able to put a rollback plan into place that you've tried out, or you just kept everything on the current servers. So you want to make sure that that all has been tested and is ready to go before you're ready to go live. So cutover plan needs to be in place, and then you'll end up running a mock cutover the week before you go live as well. So again, from a bug standpoint, like I mentioned, all priority 1 bugs are resolved. All priority 2 bugs, there should be a minimal number of them, and they have a agreed upon time for resolution and a workaround that you can live with. And then priority 3 bugs have a post go live priority ranking. So you've looked at them, you've acknowledged them, you've set a timeline for them. Data migration. So data migration needs to be technically validated in terms of, like, does it work? Does it pull the data as expected? Functionally validated. in terms of it, does it pull the right amount of data? Does it pull the right values over? And then business validated would be, does it create the right reports? Like, is this working as intended? And then making sure that all security roles are in place. So you want to have that signed off on before you get to your go, no-go meeting. And then support. So a lot of times this is on the client to be able to manage their support process, but they want to make sure that their help desk is ready and is trained to handle the tier 1 issues. And so I'll talk a little bit more on Thursday about the levels of issues that come in, but tier 1 would be the frontline issues. Now, they're not going to solve every issue that comes to them, but they should know how to solve the basic issues, and then they should know their escalation path. And then you want to make sure that all your users are trained on how to access support, and your project team is available to help with the tier 2 or the tier 2 level issues as well too. So that needs to be in place. You need to have that training in place. So again, your core training completed, your advanced training scheduled for post go live to make sure that folks are ready to do that. And then communication wise, you're going to make sure that you've got everybody in the loop on what's going on. So your overall communication to the company, the communication specifically to those project team members, and also those areas that are impacted. So as we talked in change management, it's really about grouping your stakeholders or your users into these stakeholder groups and making sure you know how they're going to be experiencing this change. So the communication strategy needs to go hand in hand with that as well too, to make sure that the groups that are being impacted are getting the proper level of communication. All right, so what happens then on go live weekend? So there's a lot. So first off, you've set your designated time when you're going to close out your existing system. So a lot of times that's Friday at 5 p.m. Then you run through all of those steps that are in your go live checklist for the move to production. So that cutover plan or go live checklist should have a list of all of the things that you need to do. So a lot of generally first it's run reports on your existing system to make sure you've got your balances all set. Then you move into data migration mode. You probably have some configuration that you're doing within the system as well too. So that might take overnight on Friday night. And then you come in Saturday morning and you're ready to run through, some of the next steps. And that's generally when people come into the office and they start testing it and start making sure that everything that they thought was going to work does work. You generally then have some developers and functional resources available if issues do come up. So did a number that in UAT worked fine now not work in production? Is there something we can do about that to fix that real quick before we go live? And then, like I mentioned, if you get to Sunday at 5 p.m. and you don't have, and you're not close enough, so if the process of data migration you thought was going to take 4 hours, it's taking 36 hours or something insane like that, you've got to be ready to go back to the old system. So you've got to set the time for when you're going to make that call. And then again, bringing in your power users to test to make sure, whether that's Saturday or Sunday, but make sure you've done some additional testing before the normal start of business. You want to make sure that on Monday morning at 8 a.m., whenever users arrive back in the system, that the system's ready to go and you feel confident about it. And then the last thing after you go live, this is a huge accomplishment. So make sure that you take the chance to celebrate this. I wouldn't do it on the weekend of go live, but we've had pizza parties during go live weekend where we're eating pizza and just hands on keyboard doing a lot of testing. So that can be kind of fun as well too. But do something specific for the team members the week or two after you go live to thank them for all the work that they've done on the project thus far and the major accomplishment that you've made. Also, another thing to do that I suggest to companies too is prepare to give some time off to the team after hypercare, right? They put in a lot of extra hours. Try to find some way that you can give them some time to rest and recuperate here after this big long project. But making sure you take time to celebrate is one of the key things that will allow your business to be successful and allow those team members to be willing to work on phase 2 or whatever future projects that you have in mind.